welcome to another episode of Rustacean Station. I'm your host, Alan Wyma, and today we have Sean McArthur. We chatted somewhere between 2 to 3 years ago, was the last time we caught up about Hyper. And I reached out to you when 1.0 came out and said, let's do an update. This is definitely like a kind of a catch up on what's been going on with Hyper since then, what marked the 1.0. And maybe we can kind of start with, who are you? Start off with that part. And then we can go to what is Hyper. And then obviously for people who don't know, then they'll find out.
Yeah, sure. Sean McArthur handles Sean Monstar and online. I'm, I guess, an open source engineer. I've been doing open source for 15 years, doing Rust for 9, a little bit before 1.0 came out, whenever that was. And mostly been working in networking, like doing HTTP, Hyper, Request, Tokyo, Axum, those sorts of things. And for a while there, I was working with AWS to work on Hyper, making 1.0. And I recently, a few months ago, went independent and also released Hyper 1.0. I think it's been 9 years since it's been in development. So that's pretty exciting.
Well, 9 years for a 1.0, that's quite a thing. But I mean, 1.0 nowadays, at least in Rust community, I find it's like not really needed, but only, I guess, maybe to convince some companies to start using it. Then you just do a 1.0 just to kind of make some people feel better. Is that kind of what happened? Or was there something where you're like, all right, we have to, finally make it official? Or what was kind of the process? Because 9 years is a long time.
I know, right? So, I mean, some of it was just for a couple of years, it was like, I don't know what I'm doing. Everyone's learning Rust together. And then it became like, oh, well, you know what? To do proper HTTP, we need to do non-blocking networking, async, right? And then that took a while to figure out. But, all this time, that didn't mean that people couldn't use it in production. And lots of companies were using it in production. So 1.0 was largely marketing and kind of like a promise of like, okay, we're going to try and reduce the amount of breaking releases, try very hard, promise 3-ish years at least. If we don't have to break people, that's cool. But it was largely to help like the ecosystem move forward, but also to help people that were like, well, I don't know if I want to deploy a non 1.0 thing in production. That didn't stop a lot of people, but might make people feel more comfortable.
If my memory serves me correctly, didn't you say that NASA deployed something with Hyper in it, or am I remembering wrong?
I don't think it was NASA. I mean, I have gotten an email from them. Can you please confirm who contributes? So maybe something.
Okay, so maybe my memory is not exactly correct. But I mean, if they ask you if you can confirm, then it sounds like they may be using it. They may not be able to confirm nor deny if they're using it. So that's a good sign.
Yeah.
Okay, well, it seems like some people are not scared away because that was a couple of years ago that was around the time that we talked, right? Or maybe it was way before that.
I don't think it was me. It was probably someone else that mentioned that because I got an ask from them, I don't know, 6 months ago, maybe.
Only 6 months ago. Okay.
Yeah.
In any case, at least you got it, right? So if it's 6 months ago, November was not 6 months ago. They weren't scared away unless they knew that 1.0 was coming and they're just, that's why I'm starting to message you. But it has been used in nearly like every single framework, right?
No, I don't think that most people were waiting for 1.0. Plenty of people just saw like, okay, people use this in production. It works. What's a number? Just deploy.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned about like the async stuff. The async stuff was done quite some time ago, no? Because I remember we discussed about async and non-async. When I think I did use Hyper directly for a project. I used the blocking API. I think it was called blocking at the time. It's still called blocking, right? Or you still have everything like that?
In request, there's a blocking module. Yeah.
So I was using the blocking one. Yeah, because I was a little bit scared of using async, which I think a lot of people were at the beginning. It takes time to get into that. Even you were very pro. You're like, well, more you're happy to use blocking. It's totally fine. It doesn't matter. That works for you.
Yeah, especially if you're not trying to handle, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of requests a second, then it doesn't matter. You just spin up a couple threads and do blocking. It'll still use all the async stuff underneath, which has a bunch of benefits for you, but you don't have to know that.
It uses async stuff underneath even when you're using the blocking API?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it'll basically spin up the async client and runtime in a background thread and then do everything through async Hyper there. And then you just see it as a blocking API.
That's interesting. So then is it using Tokyo underneath?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Is Hyper still a part of the Tokyo ecosystem? Because I could have sworn that they shared the same website or was a link or something like that. Or am I remembering wrong again?
It's been like orbiting the Tokyo stack. On the Tokyo website, there's a mention of Hyper. when we were doing async stuff, that was like the way to do asynchronous networking for a while. With 1.0, we've finally made it. I mean, you could always bring your own, but you had to implement Tokyo async IO traits. And now Hyper's traits are its own. And there's a util to use Tokyo, but it also very much supports non-Tokyo things because there are people that are doing that.
Yeah, that's actually what I wanted to start to ask is, we still have this fragmentation within async, right? Where if you want to use different runtime, it could be a little bit tricky. I don't know if it's going to be necessarily impossible, but it depends on how you write your libraries. You have to kind of write the glue for things like small and the other kinds of other async runtimes. It sounds like you've made it so it's more agnostic now. Is that really the case?
Yeah. So instead of Hyper specifically requiring the connection types to implement Tokyo's async read, async write, Hyper now has its own runtime traits, read and write. So that allows, curl, they can provide their own IO types, or fuchsia, or some other proprietary types that I'm sure people don't bother to tell me about. And you just implement a form of async read and write. The most popular runtime to use is Tokyo. So when hyperutil has, adapter types to allow you to do that very easily, but you could use your own. Yeah.
Well, now you reminded me, right? The very first episode we did was with the curl creator and his use of Hyper, right? And you just mentioned curl, right? How is the relationship with curl at the moment? Is it more and more integrated these days? So he's got some kind of backend, right? I mean, he worked with somebody, or he did actually write some of the backend, I believe, that uses Hyper.
Mm-hmm. That's right. You can build curl to use Hyper as a backend right now. There's some known issues. If you go to curl's repo, you'll find a list of known issues to why it's not outside of experimental. We made a bit of progress 3 years ago, 2 years ago. This most recent year, there's been less progress. I've had less time to pay attention to it, but it works. You can enable it yourself. Well, if you build from source, the distros don't distribute it yet. Again, because there's a couple of known issues. But yeah, it works. Someone that's interested in tackling those last few things would make it so that it could work. I'm not a C developer, so digging into those myself would be slow. And my pile of things to do is ever growing.
Since we chatted, you've now gone on your own, right? So you're doing what? Your own consulting, or what are you up to these days besides just Hyper?
It is all Hyper. I call myself an independent maintainer. Yeah, so for the past 6 or 7 years, I've been employed by a company to work on Hyper because that company used Hyper for its products and services. Before that was Buoyant and then AWS. And I figured that it'd be nice to not work for a single company, continue to maintain Hyper, like that's my job, but go to other companies and say like, hey, you use this, like for smaller levels, would you like to sponsor? But also higher levels, like, hey, would you like me to take a look at some of your private code? Maybe you don't want to talk about it in a public issue. I'll take a look at that, provide support. So not only am I maintaining Hyper, but also now doing a bunch of businessy things.
How long have you been doing that for?
I left in June of 2023. So that's, we're coming up on 8 or 9 months.
What made you decide to go into this route? I mean, is it that you felt that this was a bigger thing than just the one company, that you needed to serve more people and they had more issues that you really wanted to help with? Or what was kind of the thought process? Because that's a pretty big step.
Yeah, various reasons. That it was something that I've been kind of thinking about for a few years. I went through a couple of life difficulties that made me say, no, now's not the time to rock the boat. But then last year I finally did. And part of it was to adjust my work-life balance. Being my own boss, I get to now say like, no, I'm not doing this. I'm not doing performance reviews or whatever sort of thing that provides a lot of stress in your normal corporate world. But another thing that too was being able to look at different kinds of problems. At AWS, I was looking at like large scale server problems, but that meant that I didn't get to see more embedded things or different kinds of clients. That was kind of like the two large reasons.
I mean, has this lived up to your expectation? I mean, have you been doing the things that you actually want to do and you find it more enjoyable, or?
Yeah, I do a lot less of the things that I found stressful, that I found less enjoyable. Looking for clients that's never something that people usually like to do. But talking with different kinds of people and being able to hear some of the things that perhaps they couldn't talk about before has been really cool. And my work-life balance feels really, really good. So it's a general improvement in my book.
How is it to try to find clients though? Because whenever you have something open source and, basically quote unquote free, meaning that you're not really paying money for it, what is your process to actually find clients? Because I think this could be quite interesting for other people who are doing, libraries and maybe they want to do this full time or they want to have a change.
Yeah. It's very little like cold calling. Most of it is people that I've met or interacted with already because it's an open source project. Maybe they're people that have contributed, people that have raised issues, people that have sent me direct messages or emails that have been like, hey, this one bug is really important to us. Could you take a look at it? And I take a look at it. And then, a year later, when I'm now independent, I'm like, hey, so that means so-and-so is using these repos. Maybe they'd be interested in more help than just that one time. They're like, hey, can you look at this one bug? Some of it is meeting people at conferences and learning like, oh, I didn't know that company X uses Hyper. That's cool. Keep that in my brain somewhere and then reach out to them a year later. Some of it is, people ask questions in Discord. It's very rarely that I'm just looking at a list of companies and like, I wonder if they could use my help. It's usually, I already have an idea that they're using these repos and perhaps they could use some help. But it's an interesting challenge as well to turn someone from, I was getting this for free, why should I pay you? That's its own challenge that I can go into as well.
Please, right? If you don't mind, I'm actually very curious because sometimes this is definitely something that I also run into.
It depends on like the level of engagement or contract that someone wants. The lowest engagement, kind of a sponsorship where it's like, what am I getting from your sponsorship? If you turn it around and think about, well, a lot of times open source is like this common good that everyone kind of benefits from, and I don't want to pay for it because someone else is going to pay for it, right? It's kind of like this Russian roulette of like, well, if no one pays for it, then eventually that thing's going to go away. So sometimes when I talk to companies, I just ask them, hey, how much are you using this stuff? You're using it a lot. Cool. How annoying or how much work would it be to have to maintain it yourself if I were to just disappear? Oh, then we'd have to put a whole engineer on that or something like that. Okay. So if you think of it as a business risk mitigation to sponsor, then I can keep doing it. And then it becomes like, okay, well, we would pay a full-time engineer to do this all year. We can pay a way smaller amount to just have the sanity check that like, this is not going away. And so like, what do they get? They get a business risk mitigation. There's more things that I can offer and I do offer. Another one is people want to be able to ask, hey, we're using your stuff and we want to know, are we using it correctly? Or, hey, we've been trying to use it and we have this problem and we don't understand why. Could you take a look? And if it's open source, public, they just put it into an issue and we take a look at it and, they could get that for free. But if it's a private project, people aren't going to post their source code into a private thing. I'm not going to have the time to go and take a look unless it's like, hey, let's get a retainer and you can now, sign an NDA or whatever. You're not going to steal their code, all that legal stuff. It's like getting an advisor, a reviewer, and then I can then take that knowledge and go back and be like, okay, so I now have knowledge that like company so-and-so is using this in a way that I didn't expect. How can I make it better for them? So like both sides benefit, but it's only possible if I set up contracts and, everyone's legally happy. And it's also, since it's time that I'm not spending like directly on open source, it's more like advising, then I have to get paid for that.
If you have to excuse me, but I've been watching a lot of Sopranos. And so when you said, how bad would it be if this thing happened to go away? It sounded a little bit like a tactic they might use, to secure the contract.
Yeah, it's not like an insurance racket.
No, it's definitely a great way to do it, right? I'm just thinking to myself, when I worked in this finance vendor, we always paid for like Red Hat. And Red Hat, I think, was actually free, but they always wanted to pay for the support because they just wanted that peace of mind that they could, if they needed to, call somebody. And obviously, the price of that is like a drop in the bucket compared to the amount of revenue they make from other stuff. So it makes sense, right? So that's definitely a great way to do it, as long as they have the extra money to throw at it.
Yeah, it's like more like a mental exercise. Like if you were to pay a senior engineer in the US a few $100,000 a year to take care of this all year long, or you can sponsor it pennies to that and make sure that it doesn't go away. It's like, which one would you rather do?
You said there's different ways of sponsorship, right? Do you have like a standard sponsorship deal that you give to corporates that you can talk about, or is it kind of per company, per request kind of basis?
Sponsorship is up to whatever someone wants to sponsor for. And that's largely like, hey, we're going to give you some money each month for you to keep doing what you're doing. To do like extra stuff, to give advice, to take a look at what they're working on. Also like security advice, like, hey, there's security vulnerabilities that are coming out. I've taken a look, you're fine. Or if you patch in this way, you're fine. Those are usually negotiated contracts that I set up.
So how many dedicated sponsors do you have at the moment?
I mainly have people use GitHub sponsors. There's also a Patreon if people prefer the terms there. There's a bunch of individual sponsors. It says 74 at the moment. But for companies that sponsor, there's 4 or 5 that are signed up to, hey, keep existing and give an amount that is livable.
Sounds pretty well. And the fact that you have a work-life balance, so that means that things are not very hectic, it sounds like, right?
That's right. Yeah. The hectic part really is as Hyper has matured and gone 1.0, security researchers pay more attention. So I spend a lot more of my life looking at evaluating. No, that's not a security problem. No, that's not a real problem. Oh, that actually is a problem. Okay, let's figure it out. That's the only stressful part now.
Are you actually adding in like tests about security issues so that way you don't have regressions?
Yeah, if it's something, it's a bug that we didn't test for, and the fix includes some unit tests for that. Sometimes it's what the specification didn't really explain that you should even care about this, and then it's not just us, it's maybe the whole industry is kind of overwhelmed. This was like last year, there was the rapid reset attack that for HTTP2 that happened. A bunch of implementations had to release fixes. Sometimes it's like that. Sometimes it's hyper specific. Sometimes it's nothing, but we have to treat it like it's something until we find out it's nothing.
So you would say that Hyper is pretty much mature. It doesn't sound like there's much more to do unless there's a new version of HTTP to come out that you want to support, right?
Well, there's HTTP3 that we don't support yet. That is probably the bigger feature to add to Hyper. We have a working H3 crate. One of my goals this year is to figure out how to expose that. There's like unstable support and request. I'd like to make that stable. Hyper does most of your HTTP needs that you'd want.
Including WebSocket or only still just request based?
Yeah, it's HTTP based. Things on top of HTTP like WebSockets we don't support. I mean, we support the ability to upgrade to some extra thing, but whatever that extra thing is, like WebSockets, would be provided by a different crate, Tungstenite or something else.
Okay, I wasn't sure if that was part of Hyper or not, but it sounds like it's not.
Not at the moment. Server frameworks, it's like this interesting balance between like, is it HTTP? There's a lot of stuff that people associate with HTTP that's like, well, it's actually like a thing on top. So Hyper tries to, okay, if it's not strictly HTTP, then we'll give you the valves, the pieces you need to integrate, and then get out of the way.
Now that you brought about the whole web framework thing, I would love to get your take. There's a lot of web frameworks, right? I did see David Peterson contributing to Hyper. I can't think of one that doesn't use Hyper underneath for all the different web frameworks. Is there any that you think that are like really interesting or that you find people should be looking at or anything like that?
Short answer, Axum.
Axum. That's Peterson's, I believe. That's part of the Tokyo project, right?
Yeah. It builds on a lot of the things that we learned through building Tower. It's built on Tower. So it allows for a really nice middleware system. But it also provides a lot of the things that someone's like, okay, I don't care about that. I just want server framework to work. That's also Axum. A few years ago, I made Warp. That was a lot of fun. It still works. It's different. And for a lot of people, it's different in a way that they don't like. And that's fine. I said it up front, like, yeah, the point is to be a little different. It's not just to be Sean's web framework. It was meant to stretch, abuse the type system. But if you're not someone that's like, I really want functional servers, functional programming, I really want to stretch the type system that way, use Axum. They'll be happy with it. It's fast, it's configurable, makes sense. Yeah, use Axum.
It's interesting because I don't hear a lot of people talking about Axum compared to some other ones. I know somebody wrote a book about Warp from Manning. I'm sure you must know who that is. There's the other one that is quite popular. I forgot the name now. That was written by Luca Palmieri in his Rust book. What was that one called?
I think it's Actix.
Actix, yes, that's right. Actix Web. That one's probably the most popular, probably because it's the most oldest, I believe. It's definitely an older framework, I would say, compared to some of the other ones that have been coming out.
Yeah, I'd agree that Actix definitely was the most popular for a while. I don't know how we'd measure what's most popular. When I pay attention to like Reddit questions and stuff, I notice a lot of people also suggesting and talking about Axum.
I definitely hear about it more though, because it just came out only a couple of years ago, I think.
Yeah, it's probably 3 years old, maybe.
So are you still working on Warp, or is it kind of just parked at the moment?
I can't spend that much time on it. I hope to eventually update it to Hyper 1.0, but it works. Could it have new features? Sure. I tried to make it so it works with Tower middleware. So any like new things that people wanted to add, hey, you can just make a middleware and it should work with Warp. And what I was also glad about it is that it inspired some improvements to Actix and also Axum. It improved the way arguments are passed to functions. It did some H-list stuff that Actix and Axum both lifted. So it's stable and working, but I don't have the same amount of time that I did before to focus on Warp.
So nobody's looking to sponsor you for Warp?
I have seen some people say like, yeah, we would love to see a couple more things in Warp.
You're busy enough with Hyper, it sounds like, especially that's the core of so many things out there.
Yeah, there's a lot more ask for improvements, bug fixes, performance in Hyper, and request a lot more than other server frameworks, especially because Axum does so much. And it's less weird, so people like that.
Well, I was actually going to say my use of Hyper, now that I remember, because I was just buzzing through your GitHub, was actually request. I actually used a request using the blocking module. That was my request. I didn't use Hyper directly, but that just uses Hyper underneath, I believe, right?
Yes. Yeah, like I mentioned, the blocking module spins up a thread to run async Hyper in the background and then exposes it as blocking.
Sneaky, but still works great.
Yeah, in some ways it works better than just doing blocking IO directly, because you can still respond better to network events. You can do better work with timers. You can support protocols that require constant reading, like HTTP2. It'd be a lot harder with blocking IO.
Oh, okay. Kind of coming back to the main topic. So you had the 1.0, you just basically said, okay, it's time. We haven't really had much breaking changes. We're in a good state. Let's do this, right? And at the time, you were already full-time on working on Hyper, it sounds like.
Yeah.
You were just 2 months in or something like that, if I look at the time.
Even when I was at AWS, I was full-time on Hyper. It's just changing who was paying me.
So you did it, and then you had 1.1 and 1.2 release, and those were not, and we were just talking for the show, like, no offense, but even you said that they're not really super exciting. They were just normal, just releases, right?
Yeah, we didn't go like, oh, after 1.0, look at 1.1, look at all the things that it can do. We're more following like standard Semver, where it was like, okay, a month has passed. There's a couple of new options that are available. And technically that means it's a minor version. It's not like 1.01 because it's not just some bug fixes. It adds some stuff. So yeah, 1.1, 1.2. Probably come out with one like every month or two.
Do you have a release cycle that you follow, like a time schedule?
At the moment, no. It's mostly when there's, there's some important bug fixes or there's some new patches here. There's some new features. Yeah, let's release it.
Is that your choice only, or do you have a committee that runs this?
It's mostly my choice. There's a group of collaborators that help when they have the time, but I'm the one that pays the most attention. So I'm the one that does the work for the releases.
You did say that you're going to do HTTP 3. Is that going to be version 2.0 or any plans for 2.0?
No, I think when we announced 1.0, we said we tried to keep it stable at least for 3 years. In my mind, like I know Semver does allow you to increase the major number without any breaking changes. Maybe that's something we do. I don't know. But for the most part, if it's settled on, well, there will be no breaking changes. It'll just be additions. So when HTTP 3 becomes available, it'll just be 1.10 or whatever it is. And you can just keep upgrading fearlessly, knowing nothing's going to break. And now you can use HTTP 3. Version 2.0 is it's not something that I've thought about. We could do it, but hopefully not for a few years.
I mean, stabilizing API is really tricky. You said 3 years. Was that your own goal? Was that, okay, if this stuff is stable for 3 years, then we're ready to do 1.0? Or was it, okay, it's been 3 years, I think we can do it? You did say the number 3 years at the beginning, right?
Yeah. Before we did Hyper 1.0, I was involved with Tokyo's 1.0 release as well. That was back in 2020, I think. And likewise, we'd said, okay, Tokyo 1.0 is going to come out and there's not going to be a 2.0 at least for 3 years. And the reason back then was to give people the feeling of, okay, I can upgrade to 1.0. I can do the effort. Sure, it's going to be painful upgrading from, I think it was 0.2 in Tokyo. There were some breaking changes. It sucked. But I can do it knowing that once I upgrade, I can pull in patches easily and it's stable, for at least 3 years. So I like that idea that, people could feel comfortable. Okay, it's going to be a little painful because we changed some things, but once you're upgraded to 1.0, you don't need to worry about breakage. And 3 years, we were coming out with new versions of Hyper like every year. There was 0.10, 0.11, 0.12. Like each year there was this set of breaking changes. So it didn't seem like much of a promise to say, don't worry, for a year we'll be stable. It's like, well, we already were. So giving a promise of 3 years felt like more of a, yes, we promise it's actually going to be stable. You can upgrade. Hopefully I see less people still using 0.12, 0.11, which I occasionally still see. It's kind of scary.
If you see that, do you even bother to help them, or you just say, hey, could you please upgrade? This has been I'm not going to backport a fix for you, or what's kind of your style?
Yeah, for the most part, if I've seen an issue filed for something like that, it's hey, the last release for that was 3 years ago. Please upgrade.
Has there ever been I cannot upgrade because blah, 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 so I need help? Or is it just all right, I'll figure this out?
No, not yet. I do realize that people will be slow to upgrade to 1.0 because there are some changes that are just painful enough that they'll just stay on 0.14 for a little while. And that's fine. I expect to backport important fixes, at least for a little while. I haven't said for how long, but it'll be when it seems like a significant portion of people are no longer using 0.14. It's not like an LTS version where we promise this many years of support, but more of a good deed. Protect the internet that's still using Hyper 0.14.
Now, I do have a question about the API, right? To me, I'm always changing my code all the time. How can you possibly decide on your static APIs that you're always going to be supporting? Did they just come out after some time and you're like, all right, this pattern works? Or do you really need to design something and take quite a while to really think about all the different possibilities and all that? Or I'm guessing probably the former, no?
Yeah. Some of it just has been stable. The general shape has kind of looked the same for years. And so that was kind of easy to say, okay, people haven't needed a different shape that much, or if they have, we've been able to support it in this way. And so being able to stabilize on that was kind of, well, it hasn't changed in the past 5 years of Hyper. We did some work to go and check, okay, are there people we're excluding because of this? And are they people that we could reasonably support? And after a few months of interviewing users, found no, it's pretty stable. The pooling client, the way it did connection establishment and supporting ALPN and all of that, that had kind of changed with each release. So when we did Hyper 1.0, we're that doesn't seem stable. Each year it's needed some changes, breaking changes. So that was part of the thing. What we did with 1.0 is said, since it hasn't stabilized, that part's going into a different crate that's going to be less stable. And that's fine, because connection establishment itself isn't something that's hyper specific. Like we said, you can bring your own IO from wherever you want. So it kind of felt right. These parts have changed. They're not stable.
When you release it, right, and you do start to find things that maybe don't fit, right? Because it's always okay, when we hit 1.0, then we're going to try it, right? You have RC1, RC2, RC3. I'm not sure if you did that style. You probably did. And then you gave people a chance to try it. And then day one, when you're all right, people tried it. And then you're oh, crap, here's all these reports that I was asking for X amount of time. Was there a time where you're all right, we maybe need to change this? Or was it just well, where were you? And sorry, this is kind of where we are for some time.
Yeah, more the latter. It was hey, here's a bunch of RCs. In fact, we did RCs for about a year. And it wasn't until it was okay, this is the final RC. Things seem stable. It's good. And then it was there appeared a few points actually, we would love it if it were totally different in this way. Well, kind of late for us to just start changing everything after RCs have stabilized. Sorry. Let's see if in an issue we can figure out a way to work around the way the APIs are currently designed so that you can do what you want to do. It does mean that there will also be things where, a few months after we go 1.0, people will be hey, by the way, this thing's done. And we completely missed it. I'm cool. We get to live with that for 3 years or whatever. We can deprecate things and come out with hey, here's the new and better way, but it's going to have perhaps a less desirable name. It'll be option 2 instead of that option.
I'm kind of curious about how you actually managed to mitigate this one. You mentioned a couple of ways. So all the ways that you just mentioned are actually ways that you have mitigated these sudden issues that came up after 1.0 came out, right?
We haven't had to change anything yet. There's been a couple of people proposed, oh, it'd be great if you could do this other thing. And the answer was basically like, it would be great, but we don't have the time to evaluate how much that will change Hyper. But anyone's welcome to explore it, and we'll see how that goes.
Have you been writing down like a list of things that maybe you would change, and then, when you get to it, you're like, all right, maybe it is time for a change. It's been, the 3-year period, like you said. Maybe it is time for a 2.0, and we've learned a lot of things after releasing 1, right?
Mm-hmm. I haven't kept a private list. It's pretty much all in the issue tracker. If something would be a breaking change, then we label it with a breaking change. And it's not something we can do right now. We can close it or postpone it or something. And then, maybe 3 years from now, go and take a look at all the issues that are labeled that and say yeah, you know what, this would be worth breaking for. But at the same time, I'd love to not have to break people. Even though, the promise is only for 3 years, I'd love to not have to.
Did you just say break people, or did I hear wrong?
That is what I said.
Okay. We did go back to the mafia reference, right? Okay. But no relation, right?
Exactly. Yeah. No breaking kneecaps.
Yeah. I know what you mean. We love not to have any breaking changes and break things, but yeah, but sometimes you have to, as they say, you have to break eggs to make cake or whatever.
Right.
So you have your 1.0. It's been going well. You got 1.1, 1.2, not so exciting. As you said, you have in the pipeline, you have HTTP3 somehow coming out sometime relatively soon. I'm guessing 6 months, 1 year, something like that.
Yeah, it works. It's a little bit trickier to stabilize an API because it doesn't use a typical IO stream like TCP. So figuring out how to stabilize that is one of the goals of this year. I mean, I'm guessing you were going to ask if there's anything else that I'm looking at as well.
Definitely. What else is on the horizon? The
other major thing is improving. There's all this stuff in Tower, and it's great. There's Axum, you can use it to make really powerful servers. But the point of this middleware was actually that you could use it both ways. You could use it for servers, but you could also use it for clients. And that doesn't work as well. The most popular thing to use for clients is request, with a W.
Yeah.
And it doesn't fit in to Tower middleware. It has a bunch of extra stuff like redirects and what's some other things that it does, various kinds of timeouts, which would be great middleware, but it's currently all just wrapped up in requests. And then also, if you even just look at the middleware in the first place, it's opaque. You have to understand how to do service discovery to then use load balancing. You have to understand how to build a retry policy before you can fit in retries and understand what is a retry budget. And it's complicated. And it'd be nice if people could just get hey, this is better for 95% of use cases. And if you really want to go and tweak your retry policy, sure you can. There's the escape hatch over there. But that's my other thing to work on. Make request and Tower's client middleware merge together a whole lot nicer. So you can have much better stacked clients.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the whole retry thing because you do have some APIs which are nice, do return back oh, you've reached your limit, come back in X amount of time. I'm guessing you handle that because you had the HTTP spec backwards, forwards, upside down, sideways. So having to handle that automatically is really good.
Yeah, and also since there wasn't a really easy plugin, then people implement retries themselves, and that includes making themselves vulnerable to retry storms and just not doing it in a safe way. And the thing is that we have this middleware and things that would protect you from that, but they're just complicated enough that people are I can just retry in the loop. Yeah, but then you smash the server once things start falling apart. And it'd be so much better if you just add in a retry layer. It's going to do things wisely. And maybe you say and you know what, on this URL, never retry it, but otherwise do the default thing. It'd be so much nicer if you didn't have to understand how bad retries can go.
Yeah, I forgot about that. Or even pooling workers and all those kind of things to make sure you don't exhaust yourself. And also, like you said, exhaust the server. You're not going to make people very happy if you beat the hell out of them with requests.
Yeah, and if you just do a simple counter, then you might have counters at various layers and maybe your counters aren't shared. And now, even though your trying to be nice to the server, you're still retrying, thousands of times. Whereas a shared budget or something would notice after a few retries, hey, the server's overloaded. Let's stop pounding it. Because as long as we keep trying, it's never going to get back up. That's one of the problems with retry storms. Think of the Linger D blog, or maybe it was the Buoyant blog, had a really nice blog post on that and how you can fix that using Tower middleware. But I'd prefer it if people didn't have to read that to use it.
Yeah, if it's built in automatically. Yeah. I forgot about some of these things because, you'd never really think about them. You think, oh, yeah, like you said, just retry. But if you have that, 5 threads going at the same time doing the same thing, they may sync in where it's just like a round robin of requests and never stop. And then you'll never get a chance to ever retry, like you said.
Yeah, exactly. That's the goal is HB3, but then also improve a stacked client middleware, however you think of it, smarter clients.
Now that you're on your own, right? Like you said, you do go to conferences. Are you planning to give any more conference talks or go to any conferences coming up?
I'd like to. I saw that RustConf's going to be up in Montreal. That seems cool. I was thinking of going to Rustacean, but I didn't book tickets, and it's coming up in like a couple of weeks. But I mean, yeah, I'd love to go to some more conferences. Sure.
I think we went through basically a really good overview of what you've been up to. What happened. Is there anything else you wanted to say? I mean, are you looking for more sponsors or work or anything like that?
Sure. Always looking for more sponsors. Always happy to entertain the idea of a retainer and helping to advise, or people that are, like they're deploying this and they care about the security part. They don't want to be vulnerable when it's announced. They want to be able to know, like, hey, if it's legally and ethically possible, can I deploy patches earlier? Yeah, there are cases where that's allowed. Sure. Always looking for more of those.
This kind of popped in my mind. Has there ever been a situation where somebody was using Hyper in such a weird way that you were just like, what are you doing with Hyper now?
Probably. I'm sure there's a couple. I just can't think of them right now.
There's usually some interesting stories sometimes you hear and you're like, really? Oh, I never really ever thought about that or ever thought you'd be using that for that. That's interesting. Then you have to kind of think about how you can help solve their problem.
Yeah. I don't know if any of them I've ever gotten to, okay, let me help solve that for you. It's kind of, if there's been anything, it's like, why are you bending it that far that way? The better tool to use would be this other library or something like that. And then I just never hear from it again.
Oh, maybe it helps solve the problem. Or maybe they just thought, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Or maybe both.
It's very probable. They'd be right.
Yeah. Well, it's good to have you on again. It's good to hear that you're going strong. And it's also great to hear that you're on your own and it's been successful so far. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, it feels really good. I'm hoping it's sustainable long term. We'll see.
Well, so far, so good. And I wish you good luck on that.
Thanks.
And with that, thank you for joining me again. And maybe we'll meet again for, I don't know, HTTP 3 or who knows what else, or the next version of Warp.
Yeah, it would be pretty cool. Look forward to it. Thanks.